Okay, today this lesson is going to be about the 10% plan, which was Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction of the South, versus the Wade-Davis bill, which was Congress's attempt at Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War. All right. As early as 1863, Union leaders worried about how to rejoin the North and South. There were four major issues that they had to figure out. One of them was who would rule in the South once it was defeated, who would rule the federal government, Congress or the president. There was a conflict there over who had more power. Was it the Congress, which was the traditional idea of who was supposed to have more power, or the president, who had a lot of power during the Civil War? Because it was wartime, the president had more power than he had before. What would be the rights of freedmen, meaning free black people? And would Reconstruction be preserving the old system, so basically the way things were before the war, or would this be a creation of a new republic? And by that we mean a new system or a new culture coming out of this particular war. Lincoln wanted Reconstruction to be relatively quick, relatively painless for the South. Since the war was already so devastating, he figured that there was already a lot of suffering among the people of the South by this time. So he was more concerned about just reforming the Union. He proposed pardoning ex-Confederates, except for the highest-ranking military and civilian officers, meaning the highest-ranking generals and governors and lieutenant governors and state assemblymen, that sort of thing. Those people would not be pardoned necessarily if they were at the top of the chain, but the majority would be pardoned completely, so they wouldn't be held liable for any of the actions of the Confederacy. His plan was once 10% of a state's voting population took an oath to the U.S. and established a government, the new state would be recognized. So once again, the way it works is once 10% of the state's voting population, so Tennessee said they have 10,000 people, once 1,000 people took an oath to the U.S., to the United States government, and established their own state government, the new state would be recognized and be allowed to rejoin the Union. So this is different than what the Constitution says is the way for states to enter the Union. And we're going to talk about that right in a second, because the Wade-Davis bill prefers to do it the way that the Constitution says. But so we have Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas all create these loyal governments, in quotations, loyal governments, in 1864, but Congress wasn't thrilled with Lincoln's 10% plan. So even though we have a couple states coming around and forming these new governments, Congress wasn't all that thrilled. And it came down to these two guys in particular. Radical Republicans, remember, radical Republicans, these are the extremists in the Republican base, but they were running the show in Congress. And we have Thaddeus Stevens on the left and Charles Sumner on the right. They led the charge by advocating a conquered provinces approach to Reconstruction, which argued that since the southern states seceded, they lost their statehood status, so they weren't allowed to be states anymore, or they couldn't just be states again so easily. They decided to leave the Union, they lose all rights and privileges of being states in the United States. As a result, they should be treated like conquered foreign lands. This was their thesis, that since they left, they lost the rights of being states, and in order to come back into the Union, they have to be completely reorganized, or they have to go back to the status of being an unorganized territory, like all those places out in the West, Oklahoma being an unorganized territory still, and before Kansas-Nebraska Act, like those two territories in the West, those were all unorganized territories, then eventually they became states. These two guys and the radical Republicans in general believed that the Southern Confederate states should have to go through the same process. So they would have to be unorganized, then reapply for admission into the Union. So a bill was constructed. In July of 1864, Senator Benjamin Wade, who was from Ohio, and Representative Henry Davis from Maryland co-sponsored the Wade-Davis bill, which had three components. One, it demanded a majority of white male citizens to participate in forming a new government. not necessarily in the government, but voting for it to exist. So now we needed to have a majority of people swearing it. A majority of people have to vote to set up the new government and be participating in some way. It couldn't just be 10%. It had to be at least 50% plus one. Second, in order to vote or be a delegate to a constitutional convention, that's important, I'll come back to that in a second, every man would have to take an ironclad oath, in quotes, declaring that they never sided with the Confederate war effort. So they would not only would a majority have to vote to establish the government, but a majority would also have to take an oath declaring their allegiance to the Union and not to the Confederacy. And as far as the Constitutional Convention aspect goes, in order to be a voter or to be a member of the Constitutional Convention, here's what I mean. The Constitutional Convention is necessary for particular instances when an amendment needs to be passed. So think about it for a second. This is 1864, July of 1864. You learned in the last chapter that in June of 1864, the Republican Party created their platform, along with Lincoln, to create a constitutional ban on slavery. A constitutional ban means that they have to have an amendment. And if there's going to be an amendment, there needs to be a constitutional convention in every state in order to ratify that amendment. So look at what this does. In order to be a member of the delegation to a constitutional convention, which is the body that decides whether or not to ratify the 13th Amendment ending slavery, you would need to swear an oath denouncing the Confederacy and fully supporting the Union. This keeps the most hardline Confederates away from any place of power and would keep them from being able to shoot down the 13th Amendment. It's a little confusing. We'll talk about it a little more in class. The third thing, all officers above the rank of lieutenant and all politicians in the Confederacy who were in power during the war would be disenfranchised, meaning that they would not have the rights of citizens of the United States, including the right to vote. So even if you swear an oath of allegiance, if you were a officer above the rank of lieutenant in the Confederate Army, or if you were a politician that was actively serving during the Civil War, you wouldn't be allowed to vote still. So that would be gone. And that took away a lot of the power of the people that were high in the Confederacy, a lot of them, big players. Now, Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill, which basically means that he vetoed it. This is just a different form of veto. And he said that he didn't want to commit to any one plan for Reconstruction. That was his reason for vetoing the bill. That didn't go over very well with the radical Republicans, because remember, this was July of 1864, which meant that Lincoln had not been reelected yet. So radical Republicans turned on him for a while, accusing him of being too lenient on the conquered South. They tried to make him look weak on the Confederacy. But this kind of shows a point. They had two very different goals for Reconstruction, Lincoln and the radical Republicans. Lincoln wanted to weaken the Confederacy and end the war. Those were his goals. The radical Republicans wanted to change the culture of the country through legislation. Two very different ideas here, and that goal was much harder to obtain than they anticipated.